Designed for profit. Now, in this segment, we're going to talk about the elements that are required for you to consider when you design your commercial farm. Now, the elements, some of them are elementary, you might think, but they are things we must consider. And as I've travelled around the world looking at aquaponics farms, I've seen so many people make tragic mistakes in overlooking the obvious. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is land acquisition. You might say that's elementary. If I'm going to build a greenhouse, I've got to have some land. But honestly, I've seen lots of people that have approached us for consultancy work and they've gotten all excited about becoming an aquaponics farmer, but they have not given any consideration to the land. Now, if you were to go and buy some land in Australia to place your farm on, you would probably pay more for the land than any other part of the operation. So it can be a big item in your consideration, your planning. Now, land considerations. Do you have land to start with? That's the question I've just asked. How much land will I need? That's the second question. Now, our basic, what we consider to be a farm module is a greenhouse 30 metres long by 10 metres wide. Now, an imperial, that's about 100 foot by about 30 feet in size. Beside that, you're going to need a farm shed. You're going to need somewhere to pack the lettuce and tomatoes off, a cool room to keep them in, a lunch room for your staff, toilet facilities, all that kind of stuff you'll have to build into your farm shed. So you need space for that as well. So there you go. Now, the other thing is you think, yes, I've got a piece of land that's big enough for that, but guess what? You'll probably want to expand your farm. So you need a piece of land that is big enough to put a second, third, fourth, maybe even a fifth module side by side to take full advantage of the market that you're going to develop. Now, later on, we will show you in some case studies we've got Pedro's farm in Puerto Rico. And you'll see particularly the land problem that Pedro has, mainly because of where he lives, but you can see how it can impact on the size of your farm very strongly. Now, will I buy the land, lease the land, or will I just rent it? Now, there's a good opportunity for renting land and leasing it actually, and the greenhouse, because in both Australia and the USA, I have seen that the cut flower industry has been totally decimated by imports. We've seen farms around Brisbane here where I live, where the farm has been in the cut flower business for like 70 or 80 years. Granddad started it, and the family has been running very successful cut flower business up until just recently. And now we find instead of the flowers being grown here in Australia, they're being flown in every night from China or some other such place at half the price, and the farmer has just been put out of business. It's just tragic. So there you've got a really good piece of land, located well, greenhouses already on it, and these places are up for rent. If you go and approach the farmer, you can enter into a rent or lease agreement. I've seen the same in the USA, particularly in California. I've seen lots of aquaponic startups start up in places just like that. Greenhouses are already there, everything's great. So there's an option. Now, land selection. I need to look at what it's like there. The terrain, is it flat? A flat piece of land is by far the best to have, make no mistake about that. Because if you're going to build on a sloping block, a block that needs terracing, for example, if that's all you can get, then run with it. But if you can possibly get a flat piece of land, make sure you do, because your operational costs, your building costs, everything that goes into it is much more expensive on a sloping block of land. Check to see where the groundwater levels are. Now, the farm that we will feature in our aquaponics section for commercial people is built in Hong Kong. And that particular farm was built on a piece of reclaimed land. Now, that's great. Hong Kong, there's not much land available, so they got this piece of reclaimed land. Now, the first problem they had was when they wanted to dig holes to put the sumps in, they found that the water table was so close to the surface that they were just not successful in having sumps that were very deep. They had to make quite shallow sumps that were much larger. So, check the groundwater levels. Check to see if there's rock there. You might choose a site that looks great, but just a few inches below the surface or 50 mil below the surface, solid rock. So you want to dig some trenches to put some pipe in, or dig holes to put your greenhouse up, and you've got a major problem on your hands. So, do some real due diligence on the piece of land. Power and water, now that comes into the land as well. Is the power nearby? I mean, power, grid power I'm talking about. Is there a good water supply? Where are you going to get the water from to run the farm? Plants need water, so do fish, believe it or not. So you need to have a good water supply. Is it going to be rainwater, municipal water, dam water, stream water? We cover that in detail in another section about water selection. Because you see, these things can add up to be failure points. They can cause your business to fail if you don't have an adequate water supply. We know of one farm in California that actually ended up having to move because the only water supply they had was well water, which was so full of carbonate hardness that they had to treat it, and the treatment became extremely expensive, to the point where it actually impacted on the profitability of the farm. So these are things that are very important to consider. Greenhouses. How am I going to select what type of greenhouse am I going to need? Or do I need one at all? That's the question to be asked. If you live in a wonderful climate like we do here in southeast Queensland, where I live, where our winters, by some people's standards, are just a joke, they're not really winter at all. We think they're cold, but they're not really. You might think, well, I can do this outdoors. And we see in our particular local area, we see hydroponic farms that are done just outdoors. That's what they do. And they're turning over lettuce crops, which turn over quite quickly and easily, so they figure we can do it outdoors. We don't recommend that because protected cropping is the new buzzword in the horticultural world now. We've seen projects now around the world where regular dirt farmers are starting to farm underneath greenhouses. Because, you know, with global warming and the extreme weather conditions we're starting to see all around the world, you know, storms that are more fierce than ever, droughts that are more fierce than ever, then protected cropping becomes very, very smart. So aquaponics done under a greenhouse is a very smart thing to do. You've got year-round food production if you do that, because if you live in an extreme climate, summer and winter, there's a huge difference between them, then the fact that you've got a well-appointed greenhouse helps extend the growing season, no matter whether it's a winter crop you're growing or a summer crop you're growing. You will reduce the possibility of weather-related and pest-related crop failure by having a well-appointed greenhouse. And these are major cost factors that can play into your business plan, particularly the weather one. To do it undercover is much smarter. The initial outlay might be a little bit there, but it really is much smarter. It's more likely that you'll be able to comply with organic certification if you're in a greenhouse, because you've got much more control over the environment that your plants and your fish are living in if you're doing it undercover. Some people are located in areas where there might be an industrial area nearby, or there might be other farmers that are doing non-organic farming practices. Now that's something you should look at carefully. We've recently had a case in Australia, in Western Australia, where an organically certified farmer lost his entire crop because the farmer next door decided to plant GMO crop. And of course the wind blew the seed across the paddock and he lost his organic certification. Now that's a land acquisition problem and also a consideration for greenhouse selection as well, because when you have protected cropping, you are much more likely to be able to maintain control over the organic certification of your farm. Environmental advantages. There's advantages in having a greenhouse environmentally because you actually can return other farmland to nature. Now you might say, how does that work? Well, really, aquaponics is a very concentrated, high density form of farming. We can grow an awful lot of crops in a very small area, and we can have complete control over the environment in which they are grown in our greenhouse. And so we can return other land that would be otherwise used for that kind of thing back to nature. Water wastage is eliminated or greatly reduced by farming in a greenhouse again, because we reduce the opportunity for evaporative losses, and we reduce the opportunity for other losses that might occur through excess wind, for example, growing across our plants, and wind damage to our plants, that kind of thing. And believe you me, that can happen, especially these days with more extreme weather conditions we seem to be experiencing all around the world. So we're going to protect our crops from a lot of those kind of things, and we're going to reduce the opportunity for crop loss that way. There's more control over our environment from feral animals, for example, and that includes the two-legged type that want to get into your farm and bring in disease and stuff. So, you know, you've got a higher chance of controlling the environment in which your plants grow, and that's from disease and damage, and also for safety reasons. You can actually lock off your farm and prevent unwanted visitors of all kinds getting into your farm. Because we can also be a good environmental citizen by doing things undercover in a protected environment. And if we can get to run our system on solar, that's even better. We've become a really smart environmental farmer. Let's look at some images now of some greenhouses that you might consider in your quest to find the right greenhouse for you. Now, if you live in a climate where you've got a lot of heat and a lot of cold, then you need to really consider the style of greenhouse. This first one we're showing you is a naturally ventilated greenhouse. Now you can see it's got the vents in the bottom that allow the cool air to enter and the vents at the top that allow the hot air to escape. So you can actually create a little mini weather system, or a mini environment actually, by having the right kind of greenhouse. And here's another one for you to look at. Big lines of greenhouses, and you'll notice they're vented from the top so that the hot air can escape. And in this particular case, they're transitioning from winter to summer, and so they've got the sides of the greenhouses all sealed off, and that's to minimise the airflow through it a little bit so it doesn't get too cool as the weather changes. Now the third one is a really good one, and I'd like to give tribute to Cord and Pen Parmenter here, who build passive solar greenhouses up in the Rockies in America. And here's an example of one of their greenhouses. Absolutely magnificent greenhouses. And these are ones that operate extremely well in conditions where you have fairly warm summers but really cold winters. And these are greenhouses that are designed to trap the heat in wintertime and also to expel it in the summertime. So they're really well worth looking at, I can tell you. Passive solar greenhouses is what they're called. And here's an example of a glass hothouse. Now you really don't see too many of these around anymore. They were all the go 30 or 40 years ago because 30 or 40 years ago they didn't have the plastics we have now to make the nice plastic greenhouses we can make. So they were made out of glass. Very, very expensive. Still, some are still built occasionally, but very, very rarely. But you might see one around the place. If you can rent it, go for it. Here's a good example of a warm weather poly greenhouse, just a simple poly greenhouse. You can see by the construction of it that it's quite simple. It's just made out of tubular steel and plastic stretched over the top. You can see it's got wind up, wind down sides in it and big open doors that can be opened to allow good ventilation to go through. And in this particular case, it's not an aquaponics greenhouse, but it's a greenhouse that's growing regular kinds of crops and seedlings, etc. for market. But it's a really good example of a warm climate poly greenhouse. Our next example is one of a double layer greenhouse. Now this one has 2 layers of poly sheeting over the top, and they actually blow air in between the 2 sheets of poly. If you look carefully right up into the apex of the greenhouse in this particular photograph, you'll see a little air inlet there, and you'll see a couple of pipes. You can just see them. Now that air inlet has got a power cord going to it, you can see. That's actually a fan that sucks air in from the outside and blows it in between the 2 layers of the poly sheeting and expands them out and keeps them apart, usually about 100 millimetres or 4 inches apart. And that provides a really good insulation layer. What happens is the UV rays from the sun can still get through and warm the greenhouse in a cold climate, but it keeps the cold out. And it also keeps the heat out in summertime. It works really, really well. But there's one drawback, and can you imagine what it is? What if the fan stops because there's a power outage? It'll collapse together. What if a bird flies by and decides to run into it and punches it with his beak or something? Something can happen that will cause a hole in it and the air will leak out. That's the disadvantage of those, is they can be a maintenance nightmare. Whilst it's a wonderful idea, they can be a maintenance nightmare. We're seeing an increase in the number of systems around the world, particularly in North America and Europe and Canada, places like that where you have severe winters, where people are doing aquaponic systems actually in old warehouses. And they're not trying to get light in from outside by changing the roof or anything. They're actually doing multi-tier systems, as they're commonly called, where lighting is used to get the plants to grow. And here's a good example of what it looks like. Now, there's a drawback with all this, and that is just the sheer cost of running the lighting systems in order to get the plants to grow. But we can talk about that more later on. So let's go through a checklist now that we'll put up on the screen for you, and that is, where are we going to locate our system? We need to have a definite idea about where we're going to locate our aquaponics system. Now, ideally, everyone wants to locate it near to where they live now. But before you even start on your aquaponics journey commercially, you're going to do a whole lot of market research to find out where the marketplace is and what kind of product that your customers want to buy. Obviously, it's smart to have the farm close to the market as possible. So are you going to be located in the rural zone out of the city, or are you going to be located in a city zone? Now, these are all really strong considerations that go back to our land choices that we spoke of earlier. We need to consider that. Where can we locate? Now, we obviously want to get as close to our market as we can, because if you add huge transport costs to your business model, not only are we not doing the planet much good because of food miles, but we're not doing our pocketbook much good either in adding unwanted costs to what we're doing. The next one, which can be a real trap, is zoning regulations. Your local county or council might have rules about greenhouses and about locating farming operations. And for example, where I live, my land is actually zoned as rural residential. And you would think that I could do whatever I like on that, but I simply can't. My council doesn't like me growing lettuce. Somehow they think it's some kind of environmental danger or something to the area, and they'd rather I be 20 or 30 miles further out of town. So you need to check carefully the zoning regulations in your area. Now, I can't tell you what to look for in your area, but you need to go and speak to your council or get online. Most councils or counties have quite elaborate websites these days where you can look at the zoning regulations and find out if a particular piece of land, you might have your eye on a piece of land. You can usually go, in Australia anyway, you can go to the local council's website and you can actually look at that one particular piece of land and you can find out what the zoning is, and you can very easily research what the zoning regulations are for that land. And just jumping back a bit, that's why it's a good idea if you can find a disused or a closed down cut flower farm, because you can bet your life that the zoning regulations are already appropriate for that. The greenhouses are already up, and oftentimes these days they're not too far from market either, because most of them in Australia were established 40, 50 years ago, and back then they were out of town. Now, due to urban sprawl, they're right on the edge of town, very close to the market. So that's a good one. So further on the checklist, we're going to consider understanding seasonal variations, and that once again is a local thing that you need to understand what your local weather is like. Do you have extremes of weather? We came across a farm once that was built in a location that was on the top of a hill. Now, the guy put it there because he thought it would have a nice outlook, but man, the wind was a real problem. Whereas on the same block of land, he could have located it just a couple of 100 metres or a couple of 100 yards distant, and it would have been sheltered from the wind. It would have had better sunlight. It would have been much better. But see, you've got to have a consideration. You've got to think like a farmer, not like a tourist. He was thinking like a tourist. He thought he'd have a lovely view, but the view cost him money, okay? So the light quality, in other words, how much sunlight am I going to get? I'm going to position my greenhouse. I might have a whole bank of tall trees. If you're in the redwood country in California, you've got these giant trees and they're going to block out all the sunlight from your plants. Plants need sunlight. Remember the one we did on plants needing sunlight, oxygen and water? They must have sunlight. Unfortunately, so many people come to aquaponics and think there's some kind of magic elixir in it and they can actually plant the plants indoors and they'll be okay. No, sorry, plants need sunlight. Very important consideration for thinking about where you're going to locate your greenhouse. Obviously, the decision about whether you're going to do indoor or outdoor is going to be decided by where you live in the world. If you're in one of those northern states of America or Canada where you have such extreme weather conditions, you might need to consider an indoor system in an old warehouse or something like that. If you decide to do it in a greenhouse, you need to make sure the greenhouse that you're going to build is very robust and is able to handle snow loads and snow landing on it. So you'd have a greenhouse that got a fairly peaked view. And we've got some photographs of that to show you of some systems that are located in those kind of areas. The production checklist is as follows. Define a target yield for the vegetables and fish that you want to grow. And this once again goes back to your marketing exercise, because in your marketing you have discovered what plants are going to sell best for you, what the local chefs and public want to buy, and what kind of things you can grow. Are they going to be just ordinary old vegetables, or are they going to be exotics? And by exotics I mean you could be growing, for example, herbs. People make a lot of money these days out of growing herbs and things like that. So you need to decide on that. what are the best price fetches, as we call them? What are the kind of vegetables or product or produce in your area that fetches the best price? You need to have a look at that. And in the case study on Pedro's farm, you'll see how Pedro approached that problem and how he discovered the best way to sell his produce and the kind of produce that would fetch him the best price. It's really very important. And don't forget the fish too. Now, many aquaponics farmers approach the whole farming project and they just simply view the fish as the powerhouse of the aquaponics system. And that's quite a valid approach in actual fact. And they're quite happy for the fish just to be there doing their job so that they can produce pure food. But you might be in an area where you can grow a particular species of fish and you can do the marketing to sell the fish as well. So you need to consider that in your marketing research when you're going through that. What kind of production are you actually going to have in your farm? Now, it will be primarily vegetables because that's the way it is. There's a whole lot more vegetables eaten every day by people, vegetables, leafy greens, herbs and all those kind of things, than there are fish. So you need to get that through your head really early that, you know, the greens is where it's at, that's where it's at. So you need to find out the greens and the kind of product that's going to sell and make money for you. The fish could be a great extra income stream. So don't overlook it, do some real research on what you can do there. Identify your mode of market. Now, are you going to use farmers markets? Are you going to use community co-ops and CSAs? Are you going to just market yourself, farm gate sales? That's quite a valid way of doing things too. I've seen a farm in California that does extremely well with farm gate sales. They also do Sunday markets or farmers markets, but their farm gate sales are really, really good. They've got a little shop out the front that's open and people come in and they've developed a real following in the local area of people who want to come there and buy their stuff. So once again too, now this might seem silly to put right here, but it's a good question to ask. Decide on whether you're going to do commercial or whether you're going to do domestic aquaponics. I'm always amused and amazed at people that discover aquaponics and within a few days they're already contemplating going commercial and they haven't even considered the steps to go through in order to get to that point. So if you're one of those excitable kinds of people and you've got all excited about aquaponics, stop and consider, are you going to go commercial or are you going to be domestic? And you need to take the appropriate steps to get to your goal. The next checklist is resources. Now these things kind of cover each other, don't they? But fresh water supply. We've already talked about that in a previous video about water source, but please don't overlook it. And when you think you've got the right water source, check the pH of the water source, the total dissolved solids in it, the EC, and look to see what kind of impurities might be in the water. Now that might require you to get a proper chemical analysis done of the water. And if you're going to do this for money and you're going to do it for profit, then I would strongly suggest you do that. Even if it looks the best looking water you've ever seen in your life, spend the money, get the water tested to make sure there's no little unseen unlovelies in it. Electricity. How are you going to power this farm? Are you going to do it directly off mains? If you are, can you be absolutely certain that you're not going to have major power outages? Some parts of the world get so used to power outages they don't actually think about it. They think, oh, the power's gone off for another hour, half an hour, and they just carry on. They're so used to it. I lived in Papua New Guinea for a number of years, and we used to jokingly say, well, the power only went off once today, all day. You know, we got so used to power outages. But you might be like that. You might think, oh, I've got to stop and think. Now, my fish cannot go without oxygen, depending on the species. If it's trout, for example, you've only got 20 minutes of no water movement and you've got dead fish. So you simply cannot afford to have power outages. If that is the case, then you need to think of some kind of uninterrupted power supply. And that could be a battery backup, could be a generator backup. All sorts of backup systems need to be thought of and costed into your system. Now, it's that important. And unfortunately, we've noticed so many people just completely overlook it. And you know the day when they find out? When they have a power outage and they lose all their fish. And it's just a disaster. We need to think about renewables when we do that because we want to be good citizens of the planet. And ultimately, I think all of us would really want to be able to run our farm off renewables. That is solar, wind, you know, one of those kind of sources of energy so that we can not take but give back to the planet.